Bruce has wanted me to just say to everybody is that you do not have to have attended the first 7 chapters of Wise Blood. You can approach this ab novo. Thursday, November 4th, we have a very interesting, kind of unusual event for us. Is Karen Coonrod, who's a director at Yale and has her own performance group there, has been doing at a couple of Flannery O'Connor events a radio show of Revelation. She's gotten permission from the estate to do this, and she's been doing a radio show of Revelation with her troupe, which goes word for word throughout the whole story. And it's just a fascinating performance. We're going to have the performance, which will take about an hour, and then we'll do an hour of discussion after that. So 7 to 8, and then 8 to 9. Then Thursday, 11/18, last but not least, we have Bruce back for Parker's Back, talking about that at 4:30 and 7. And then Thursday, 12/9, December 9th, in time for Christmas, we're going to have a stellar staff of scholars, Flannery O'Connor scholars, Taylor Black, Monica Miller, Bruce Henderson, and Amy Alsnauer, talking about Flannery O'Connor and oddity, and sort of, for instance, Monica Miller wrote the book about ugliness. Amy Alsnauer's children's book, if you are familiar with it, talks about sort of her as an odd child. What does it mean to have that oddity in her life? So sort of a fun wrap up for the semester. So let's get started without further ado. And Christine, I think I kind of introduced you already, so I think you're ready to go. As always, we are recording this, so if you do not wish to be recorded, you can keep yourself muted out, but we do ask you stay muted. And then also just be aware that if you have a comment, you can either put something in the chat, or you can just wave your hand and let me know, and I can direct it to Christine. She's probably going to do a little bit of questioning, then she's probably going to do some presentation, and then there'll be obvious points where she can do the answer some questions or do lead discussion, and I'll just be the person who makes sure that everybody gets recognized, hopefully. So let me know, and Christine, why don't you get started?
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Irene. Thank you so much. And thanks for everybody for coming out tonight. It is so great to see Flannery people. I was saying to Irene, I feel so disconnected and missing all my Flannery folks. So hello to everybody. I am the editor of this book, The Letters of Flannery O'Connor and Carolyn Gordon, and I can talk forever nonstop about the letters that I collected and edited of these 2 women, but I'll try not to do that too much. I did want to start today. Oh, and I'm a professor of English at University of the Sciences, which is about to change into St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. So I teach English and literature to science students now, and then I'm going to teach somewhere else soon, I think. Anyway, so I wanted to ask before I started, because I teach creative writing and I teach literature, and I teach the letters of Carolyn Gordon and Flannery O'Connor in my creative writing classes, which is what I always wanted to do. The publisher didn't want me to call the book the master class because there were many books by that title, but they just thought there wasn't a big audience in the creative writing population to sell to. So, but for me, Carolyn Gordon and Flannery O'Connor together are a real master class in creative writing. So that's what I want to talk about today. But before I start, I wanted to ask you either one of 2 things, and you can just jump in or write in the chat, or I'll call on you, people who I know. I wanted to ask, what do you find most memorable about O'Connor's writing? Either what do you find most memorable, what do you like about her writing the most? If you could try and describe in general terms. Watch the chat here too. people like what? Her characterization, her dialogue? What are the things that stand out the most?
I like her characterization. For me, that's just, you know, yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody said how her grumpy women, Monica said. So,
Yeah. Catherine says her natural description. Catherine, do you mean like nature and her environment and her landscape?
Her Christianity.
What's that?
Her Christianity.
Her Christianity, yes, her faith.
Catholicism, yeah, her faith is based on
and how she was able to bring that into an artistic vision for herself. Absolutely, I love that. Visual details, I agree with that. Her honesty, that's interesting. Okay, cool. So what I do then, again, I teach Flannery O'Connor, the literature of Flannery O'Connor, but I've looked at sort of this mentor of hers, Carolyn Gordon, and oh, Heidi, I love that. Herself, yes, her quippy, her humor is so great in her writing, in her letters too. Yeah. Oh, Lindsay, from hilarious to terrifying. We'll talk a little bit about the violence today. So I want to introduce Carolyn Gordon to some of you who might not know Carolyn Gordon. And I'll show you, I'm going to share my screen and show a few pictures of both Gordon so you get a sense of who she is. And I'll tell you a little bit about the background of the two women, how they met. Some of you know this already. And then I want to share some kind of back and forths between Carolyn Gordon and Flannery O'Connor, where Carolyn Gordon gives Flannery O'Connor some feedback on her writing, and then what O'Connor does with it, what the final version looks like. So I'm going to share my little screen here. And let me see here. That's slideshow. See, not too bad. There's Flannery and Carolyn. Masterclass. Move this around here. I opened my book with a description of the story of how Flannery and Carolyn Gordon meet. And some of you know this story. Flannery O'Connor is 26 years old. She's working on Wise Blood. And a long story short, she's sort of waiting to hear back from the publishers when her friend Robert Fitzgerald suggests and asks O'Connor's opinion, asks O'Connor if he can give her book to Carolyn Gordon to read and to give her some feedback on. And so it's 1951. And Carolyn Gordon has this positive reaction to O'Connor's Wise Blood, which is not yet published. And Gordon says, this girl is a real novelist. She's a rare phenomenon. And then she also, she says she relies more on her technique than just her piety. And then Gordon also provides a list of suggestions, like a few scenes revised here and there would really do wonders for the draft of this novel. And those suggestions are passed along to Flannery O'Connor. And sure enough, O'Connor takes them. And this begins a friendship between the two women. The friendship lasts for 13 years until O'Connor dies. Gordon is O'Connor's senior. Carolyn Gordon is the age of Flannery O'Connor's mother. And they meet by letter. They have shared friends. And over the 13-year period that they knew one another, they only saw each other in person 8 times. And so they have this relationship that develops through the letters and through the fact that Flannery O'Connor begins to ask for feedback from Gordon, who is never officially her teacher. Flannery O'Connor, shares her manuscripts with friends like Sally and Robert Fitzgerald, but Carolyn Gordon becomes this person she shares nearly every manuscript with. I always have to do talk a moment about Carolyn Gordon because so many people don't know her. Here she is at the end of her career teaching at University of Dallas. Carolyn Gordon was born in 1859. Her career really took off as a novelist in the 1920s. She worked as a secretary for Ford Madox Ford, and he encouraged her writing. And when Ford Madox Ford realized that Carolyn Gordon had been writing, he really got on her and pushed her to complete her work. Gordon was married to Alan Tate, the poet. They lived in New York, Rome, Paris, Clarksville, Tennessee. They were friends with E. E. Cummings, Malcolm Cowley, Dorothy Day, Catherine Ann Porter. They lived among, they were friends with many, many writers. F. Scott Fitzgerald, they once celebrated Thanksgiving with the Hemingways in Paris. And when they moved back to their home in Clarksville, Tennessee, they invited writers to come stay with them and live for extended periods of time. After Gordon published 5 novels and 1 short story collection, she converted to Catholicism. So she was 52 years old. It was 1947, so right before she met O'Connor, a few years, and she converted to Catholicism. And she believed that her vocation as a writer had prepared the ground for her conversion. And she saw all these parallels between the writing life and the spiritual life. She also began to provide a lot of support to other writers. She is well known for supporting Walker Percy, giving him feedback on his writing. Carolyn Gordon taught at so many different colleges. She spoke at different conferences. She was always teaching, and she really knew her craft. By the time she met O'Connor, and let me say by the mid-1950s, they met on the page in 1951, but about mid-1950s, when they really were close friends, friends might not be the right word, but they were close. They had a close relationship. They have such a unique relationship. Gordon was giving O'Connor feedback on writing. And at this point in time, about the mid-1950s, Gordon was at the height of her career. She had finished 8 novels and a short story collection. She had been nominated for the National Book Award with William Faulkner and Truman Capote and J.D. Salinger. She shared an editor with a number of really amazing writers. Max Perkins was her editor for the last 20 years of his life. And Max Perkins, of course, was the editor of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Woolf. So her accomplishments were really quite remarkable. And then she and O'Connor met. And the first manuscript she gave feedback on was Wise Blood, of course. And like I said, I could talk about this forever, but the collection of letters really gives these detailed moments of feedback throughout. I wanted to give you just a few samples tonight of the kind of feedback she gave O'Connor. And I was thinking that I'm going to talk to you like I talk to my creative writers, which is to say, I'm not going to talk down to you, but just assume that you'll come with me on this. And for those of you who are not creative writers, but readers, I will be really curious to hear if this gives you a different kind of appreciation for what you already like about O'Connor by learning a little bit about her craft and how her craft came from Gordon. So it's too limited to say Carolyn Gordon taught O'Connor dialogue or setting or plot. It's just it's not really adequate enough to say what Carolyn Gordon taught her. I'm going to show you a few samples. This one, again, comes from Wise Blood. And for those of you who might want to look at your collected works, this is from Wise Blood on, it's on chapter 2 of Wise Blood on page 16, where Hazel Motes gets a taxi. And Carolyn Gordon sees the original manuscript, which is housed at Georgia College. And Carolyn Gordon begins to give O'Connor feedback on how to craft this scene. There's Wise Blood. Gordon says to O'Connor, she sees O'Connor writing in an early draft, Hazel Motes, just dialogue. And she says, it's dangerous to have a character say more than 3 sentences in one speech in a row. Ordinarily, she says, one can improve dialogue by making 3 speeches out of every speech. Gordon will go back to this rule of 3. Thus, and these are Gordon's recommendations for how O'Connor should revise this scene of Wise Blood, where Hazel Motes is getting a taxi. And Hayes says, listen, I'm not a preacher. And Gordon says, then you have to have the driver react. The driver either says something or doesn't say anything. The reader has to know what the other character receives, what Hazel Motes says. Then she says, we ought to know how Hazel Motes reacts when he makes his speech, I don't believe in anything. How does the driver react? And then how does Hayes react, Hazel Motes? Here, I hope your Zoom bar isn't covering any of this. Here's the finish, that final scene, how O'Connor revised this using Gordon's suggestions. And to me, the suggestion reminds me of acting. I don't act, but I've listened and read acting, technique, and how actors are told that you're not just supposed to act, you're supposed to react. And so that's what Carolyn Gordon is saying, that for each character, there's a reaction on the other side you want to portray on the page. So there's Hazel Motes saying, listen, I'm not a preacher. I understand, the driver said. Ain't anybody perfect on this green earth of God's, preachers nor nobody else. And you can tell people better how terrible sin is if you know from your own personal experience. So there's the driver responding. And then Gordon says, now bring Hayes back in. Hayes put his head in at the window, knocking the hat accidentally straight again. He seemed to have knocked his face straight too, for it became completely expressionless. Listen, he said, get this, I don't believe in anything. And Gordon says, remember, go back to the other person. How is the other person receiving this? The driver took the stump of cigar out of his mouth. Not nothing at all, he asked, leaving his mouth open after the question. I don't have to say it, but once to anybody or to nobody, Hayes said. So an earlier draft would have had O'Connor saying, listen, I'm not a preacher. I don't believe in anything. I don't have to say it, but once to nobody. That sort of extended dialogue. And Gordon saying, break that up a little bit. When speeches are run together in one paragraph, Gordon says, the way you originally had Hayes's remarks, they muffle each other. Speeches need air around them. She gives O'Connor feedback one page later, maybe it is. Still chapter 2, if you've got your little book, page 18. But that famous passage of where Leora Watts says to Hazel Motes, you hunting something? And Carolyn Gordon says, first, I want to know how she looked when she said that to him. The fact that I can't see her makes it hard for me to believe she said that. And Carolyn Gordon gives her really specific advice for how to revise this scene. Show how Mrs. Watts looked, then have her say her dialogue. Show how Hayes receives it, then his dialogue. Then show her again and have her say something. For so many readers, this seems, it seems like, oh yeah, that's the way dialogue works in books, right? It's much different when you're producing it, I guess, from the blank page. And this kind of feedback that Gordon is giving Flannery O'Connor really fine tunes the prose. Here's the final version. And Carolyn Gordon had said, show us how she looks. Mrs. Watts' mouth split in a wide, full grin that showed her teeth. They were small and pointed and speckled with green, and there was a wide space between each one. She reached out and gripped Hayes's arm just above the elbow. You hunting something, she drawled. And of course, like some of you mentioned, this is one of Flannery O'Connor's great skill, is this kind of specificity and detail where she really gets up into a character's describing them. I want to call it the zoom in, right? She's looking at the spaces between her teeth. This to me is one of O'Connor's greatest strengths as a writer, where she can zoom in and give these particulars. But Carolyn Gordon told her, then give us Hayes' reaction. If she had not had him so firmly by the arm, he might have leaped out the window. Involuntarily, his lips formed the words, "Yes, ma'am," but no sound came through them. "And show Mrs. Watts again," Gordon said, right? "Something on your mind?" Mrs. Watts asked, pulling his rigid figure a little closer. And then Gordon said, "Show him again." "Listen," he said, keeping his voice tightly under control. "I come for the usual business." And so Gordon takes these in the letters between Carolyn Gordon and Flannery O'Connor, you find this sort of page after page. Every time O'Connor will send a draft of something to Carolyn Gordon will respond, sometimes with broad comments and sometimes with these really specific, like, describe the person followed by dialogue, give it space. One of the stories, of course, we all know, right, is "A Good Man is Hard to Find." And to me, this is a really wonderful example in the letters between the two women. Carolyn Gordon receives a draft of Flannery O'Connor's "A Good Man is Hard to Find," and this early draft does not exist anywhere that I can find. And so for any of you scholars out there, it's really interesting. You can kind of track the shadows of O'Connor's earlier drafts by reading Gordon's feedback and then looking to the final draft. And so you're all familiar with the story: family, road trip, misfit, car accident, right? The entire family, 2 young children, mother and father, and the main character, the grandmother, murdered by the misfit and his cronies, right? In the woods on the side of a road. Here's the thing about this story. If you think about it, the story doesn't work unless the conversation with the grandmother and the misfit works. That conversation is so unlikely. So how does she have us suspend our belief through that scene with all that is happening around her? The same year Flannery O'Connor was writing "A Good Man is Hard to Find," Carolyn Gordon wrote a book called "How to Read a Novel." And O'Connor read this book. And this book gives me great insight into that conversation that went on between the two women. And Carolyn Gordon said in this book, I'm thinking about "A Good Man is Hard to Find" and the ending and the misfit and the murders, right? Carolyn Gordon says, "When we are tempted to censure an author because the characters in his novel do not adhere to our own code of morals, we ought to remind ourselves that some of the greatest heroes of fiction, indeed of myth and legend, trespassed against the accepted codes of their day." Carolyn Gordon is saying what that Iowa priest said: you don't have to write for 15-year-old girls. Gordon continues, "The reader who demands that his own moral code shall not be infringed upon or have his feelings lacerated by any unpleasant happenings in any book is like a person who prefers to picnic at the foot of a mountain and forego the view he would get from the summit rather than undergo the rigors of the climb to the top." Gordon is saying it's not a problem if fiction disturbs you, if you're greeted with characters that may lacerate your feelings, right? So O'Connor reads this book again as she's writing "A Good Man is Hard to Find," and she sends Gordon a draft of the story "A Good Man is Hard to Find." Gordon generally never has any questions for O'Connor about the violence in her stories. Never. The only time Carolyn Gordon mentions violence is when she's criticizing Flannery O'Connor's grammar. And she tells O'Connor that her grammar is a particular kind of violence for her, Carolyn Gordon. But otherwise, she doesn't comment on people being murdered or horrifying things happening in O'Connor's story. What she does say to O'Connor about "A Good Man is Hard to Find" is The story doesn't have enough composition of scene. You don't have enough setting. It's not well enough located in time and place. Remember, and this is the way she always spoke to O'Connor, remember that the Lord made the world before he made Adam and Eve. Events take place in time and space. I particularly miss landscape after the misfit comes on a scene. So once again, Gordon goes from this broad feedback to zooming in, like, I miss landscape when the misfit comes on the scene. You need to add some landscape there. If I were doing it, she says, I'd show the grandmother's reaction to what is happening, or what she barely suspects may happen by the way the world, these trees, this road looks to her, and then have her concentrate on her talk with the man. So this is that end scene with the misfit. How is she going to make that end scene work? And Gordon says, I worked this device 3 times. So give me some setting, give me some landscape when the misfit comes on the scene. And then when Bailey first goes off, when the first shot comes, and then when that second gunshot happens. This is how Gordon is saying, you got to make this work. So here's Gordon. I have it highlighted a little bit here, but Gordon says, I miss landscape after the misfit comes on the scene, and the final draft has this vivid picture of the landscape. The road was about 10 feet above and they could see only the tops of the trees on the other side of it. Behind the ditch, they were sitting there, more woods, tall and dark and deep. And here comes the misfit. Gordon says, I'd show the grandmother's reaction to what is happening by the way the world, these trees or this road looks. And there at the bottom of the scene, behind them, the line of woods gaped like a dark open mouth. When Bailey first goes off, she says, you need something. You need to add a touch here. Bailey turned and supported himself against a gray, naked pine trunk. So she's sort of taking Gordon's really specific suggestions and layering them in. That's when Bailey first goes off. Here's the pistol shot, comes from the woods. And the grandmother could hear the wind move from the treetops like a long, satisfied insuck of breath. And then remember, Gordon said, work it 3 times. The 3rd time is after the 2nd shot. Alone with the misfit, the grandmother found that she had lost her voice. There was not a cloud in the sky nor any sun. There was nothing around her but woods. This kind of detail. Carolyn Gordon gave a talk, not just for writers. She gave talks to all kinds of people. In Minneapolis, she gave a talk at the Minneapolis School of Art once, and she said, all fiction consists of 2 kinds of views. There's the panorama, the broad view, the kind of view you'll get from like a 12th story window. You can see farther if you look out of the 12th story window, but you can't see closely. You can't see that blade of grass, which you could see very easily if you were down on the ground beside it. So in writing fiction, Gordon says, you constantly have to shift the focus of your camera. A story consists of alterations, long shots and close-ups or panoramas. And what Gordon continues to see in O'Connor is that she's really good with the close-up. And then she's encouraging her to add in the panorama. Gordon says it to O'Connor a different way. She says in a letter, the chief weakness in your work is the tendency to use too restricted a viewpoint at crucial moments. I would like to see you learn to soar above the conflict, to view it as if through the eyes of an eagle. After all, she says, you have a more exalted subject matter than any of the young writers. Gordon again with her writing tips. Gordon says, I had an old novelist friend who used to say that when he had a man turn the knob of a door in one of his novels, he had first to create the knob and then the door in which it was set. And then the wall of the door was a part of the house and the town and the village and the region, and then the country, until finally he had created the continent. Flannery O'Connor repeats Gordon's lessons. The lady who writes, whom I admire very much, she says in Mystery and Manners, that's Gordon, wrote to me that she learned from Flaubert that it takes at least 3 activated sensuous strokes to make an object real, or to make a landscape real, right? Gordon talking about another time she talked about O'Connor and this distinction between the zooming in and the panorama. Gordon would say to O'Connor, I admire the core of dramatic action, but I think the whole book would gain by not being so stripped or bare. Suppose we think of your scene in the novel as a scene in a play. Any scene in a play takes place on some kind of a set. I feel that the sets in your play are great, but we never see them. And then she says, a spotlight follows your characters. But it's a little like a spotlight a burglar uses when he's cracking a safe. It illuminates a small circle and the rest of the stage is in darkness. And so this was another way she said to O'Connor, give us more of that panorama view. It would be better, she said, if you occasionally used a spotlight large enough to illuminate the corners of the room, for those corners have gone on existing all through the most dramatic moments. So many people say what they love about O'Connor is that sort of the tree line of woods that always appears in the background. And this is a layer that comes from Carolyn Gordon. I want to give just one more example, and then I want to open it up and we can talk maybe about some stories or what this makes you think of. But there's one more suggestion that Carolyn Gordon gives Flannery O'Connor that I love, and it's about viewpoint. And any of you who fuss with O'Connor know that she struggled with her point of view. And if you know Carolyn Gordon always said, like, the omniscient narrator speaks like Dr. Johnson. But here's a really interesting idea about viewpoint that Gordon teaches O'Connor. She says, and she gets this from, this draws on like a lot of theory and fiction from Percy Lubbock and all these creative writing theorists. Henry James. Carolyn Gordon says, we all need to know about viewpoint if you're going to be a writer. So she says to O'Connor, imagine a room with a window and a person standing next to the window. Next, there's a stool sitting below the window, and a second person is sitting on the stool, watching the face of the first person. So Gordon says the reader is the one sitting on the stool. The reader is like a prisoner, seated on a stool so low that he cannot see out the window. The reader must see what is reflected in the eyes of the figure at the window. And that would be the point of view of the story. At first glance, Gordon says, this would seem to restrict what he sees. But if he sees through his own eyes what is reflected in another pair of eyes, he will see twice as much. Here's a great mystery of the craft, Gordon says. I can't explain it. I just try and tell you how it is to me. And O'Connor writes back, O'Connor understands this immediately. And she says, forget about Henry James. My mother's dairyman's wife helps me understand this. And O'Connor says, this woman, the dairyman's wife, hangs around all the time. And all her sentences begin, I know one time my husband seen. And O'Connor said to Gordon, it works like you say. He sees everything and she sees twice as much as he sees, but she's never looked at anything but him. Back to A Good Man is Hard to Find. Remember that final scene with the grandmother and the misfit? And Gordon says, there's a point of view that we need to work on here. How do we capture the grandmother's point of view? How do we make it believable as each family member is walked off one at a time and killed in the woods? So Gordon says, here's this one little trick. And maybe I can explain it to you by telling you the origins of my novel, The Strange Children. Gordon said, my main character, the heroine, is 9 years old. Every event in the action is reflected by 9-year-old Lucy. I'm going to stop sharing actually now. We don't need that picture anymore. Every action is reflected by this character, 9-year-old Lucy. Henry James said you had to have a character who was capable of morally evaluating what happened to him, what was happening to him. Sometimes the recording intelligence records more dramatically when it does not know what it's recording. So Carolyn Gordon goes through this big example of my 9-year-old character sees a man and a woman. And because she's 9, that's her only interpretation. But the reader, with the information the reader has, understands that the man and woman are having an affair in this book. The reader realizes, Gordon says, what the young girl does not. I think that this very little trick, the consciousness recording something it doesn't understand, children often do that, would be very helpful to you, she says to O'Connor. I feel that your grandmother ought to record the fact that something is happening or going to happen without understanding it. She is just the kind of character made for this device. And sure enough, we, the reader, right? We hear the gunshots, family member after family member is taken off stage, while the grandmother sits there and tries to communicate with the misfit. She's like a child, unable to fully register what is happening. And the reader understands the horror completely. I could go on for so long with sort of Carolyn Gordon and the kind of feedback she gave to Flannery O'Connor, but I'm wondering, I'd love to hear from some of you, and if you have an interest in certain stories, or if you have an interest in some kind of creative writing, or if you have a thought from any of this.
Christine, well, Monica asked that question, and then I'll ask mine. Monica?
Hey, Christine, I could listen to you talk about this all day. So I have a question, and from what you've read and all of the stuff, how does Gordon's critique, advice, writing, feedback, how does that compare with what Flannery got at Iowa? Do you have a sense?
I have no information about that, and you might know more about that from the things you've seen, the Iowa papers. My understanding of what Gordon has done is really in so many ways based off what I know from personal experience. Like, I went through an MFA program. I know what feedback looks like. I know what feedback doesn't look like. And it doesn't look like this, the kind of thoughtful, detailed, for no self-serving reason at all. Carolyn Gordon got nothing out of this. The level of detail, I would be curious to know, but here's what I think without having proof of it. I think that O'Connor was a good student at Iowa, and that what they taught, she really paid attention to, craft-wise. So when Gordon dropped this stuff in her lap, there's a reason why O'Connor was able to then turn it around, because it's two parts here. It's not just Gordon saying, here, do this, but it's that O'Connor could rise to the occasion and do it. Story after story after story. And that the two women, spoke such, I think there's something to do with, the Catholic faith and the faith of the Catholic artists, that they communicated effectively with each other, though they never really talked about it. I don't know. Have you seen anything from Iowa? Have you seen anything like where I know in the Wise Blood papers, I was looking at Driggers and Dunn, and they were saying like there are some comments and they don't know if they're from folks at Iowa. They think they're, copies of what she was working on with feedback from her teachers there. Do you know anything?
I haven't really paid that much attention to the manuscripts from Iowa, although she did tell her mother when she got to Iowa, she said, these people know what they're doing. These people have something to teach me. And something that I really appreciate about what she said about Iowa is that she recognized that there were things that she could learn and that they could teach her. It's interesting because there's quite a bit that she talks about in her letters to her mother about just the professionalization of writing, of not just, meeting agents and but also getting headshots made, and just like the real business of writing. She and Gordon didn't really talk about that much, other than maybe like some of the stories in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, getting Good Country People in it, for example. But yeah, I appreciate
Good
that.
country people,
She
Oh,
knew
go
that,
ahead.
that there were things she had to learn, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, Good Country People is a great example because Alan Tate wrote a letter to O'Connor and he's like, great, put it in your next collection, like 2 sentences. I suspect that people did not give Flannery O'Connor a lot of one-on-one attention. I suspect that she absorbed a lot because of her own intellect and because of her own drive. But I don't believe that. I would be astounded to hear that anyone spent this much time on one of O'Connor's manuscripts while at Iowa. But that's just because Carolyn Gordon did things nobody else did. I mean, she wrote, 22 pages to Walker Percy. She would just do this for people. It's astounding. I've had, I still have a copy of the first paper that I wrote, like a creative paper, where a teacher gave me feedback. It was so powerful to me. And I look back, it's like 3 words the teacher wrote on it. And then I had some teachers in grad school who would write me the pages and pages. And the value of what that teaches you is just, it might come from, I don't know if part of it comes from that Gordon had a background in journalism too. I've been edited really well in nonfiction and journalism. So I don't know.
Christine, one of the things I've been thinking about, said O'Connor was kind of a child of the agrarian movement. And I know because of going to Georgia College in the 70s, you were hard pressed to find O'Connor's name. No one talked about her. No one talked about her life. It was just beginning to be focused on. And I think a lot of that has to do with that deep commitment to the close reading and the other tenets of new criticism. And I just wonder if some of this instruction actually grew out of that, because of course Gordon was connected to Tate and Penmoran and the others who were pushing that, and sort of the values that are embedded in a new critical, I'll go back and use the same word, valuation. What do the new critics think is great? Then O'Connor kind of sat down and did that. This story functions totally on its own. We don't have to think about the author. We don't have to think about feelings. It functions just as a thing unto itself. And who were Gordon's teachers? How did I know you said she worked for Ford Maddox Ford. Who were her instructors? How did she learn how to write?
If I was going to give credit to an instructor, I would give credit to her father. Her father enrolled her in a boys' classical school when she was a young girl. And so she learned Greek and Latin, and she was attending school with boys when she was young. She was born in 1895. So, her father really gave her an intellectual life. I think I would have to reread my own book, but I think she went to college at 16. And I think she was always among really smart people. Yeah, Martin, John Dunaway is saying Jacques Martin was one of her most important teachers and one of her best friends. She really, she talked about at Bethany College, a teacher, but she really worked hard herself. She, and very similar to O'Connor, another thing they did not talk about. They never they did write about like, what are you reading? Like what I'm reading now and stuff. What each woman had like a really rigorous intellectual life that they were devoted to. So I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
we have some questions in the comments. Craig Martell, I think, is the first one to have asked us. Craig, do you want to open up your mic? You're still muted. There you go.
Yeah, Christine, just a quick question. Any comments that you might make about a Temple of the Holy Ghost? We're discussing it as
Ooh.
in a small group at our church. So just open-ended question.
Temple of the Holy Ghost. I'm going to look in my own index and find out. I don't remember Gordon giving feedback on that one.
I did not see any, looking at the index and tracing it back through your book.
Yeah, there was a little spell in time. Do you remember what the date of Alex does, Bruce does? What's the date of publication of Temple of the Holy Ghost?
Don't have that at my fingertips.
The Holy Ghost. Yeah, I don't think she read and commented on that. There's some missing, but I would think, Temple of the Holy Ghost reminds me of that passage I just read, that whole, I believe, was Temple of the Holy Ghost before or after A Good Man Is Hard to Find? Before?
It was 53, the publication.
And so A Good Man Is Hard to Find is 55, right? That's reminding me of the thing I just said about the vision of the child and how the child is kind of the recording eye.
Yeah.
No,
that's good.
Eye of interpretation. That's a really interesting layer. So, but that feedback of Gordon would have been after that story. That's kind of interesting. O'Connor's always operating with these child characters who see the world as adults, The grandmother is different because she's an adult who's like a child, right? She's sort of, at the end, her feet are splayed out like a child too. A lot of O'Connor's older people, the children are like adults and the adults are like children.
I think Lindsay Alexander also has a question for you. Lindsay?
I love Lindsay's question, yeah. The
You wanna
answer
mute?
is,
Yeah.
Lindsay
Go ahead.
says, I don't know if Lindsay can, Lindsay says, like, did doing this change the way I wrote, I believe?
Sorry, I have an emotional 2-year-old. So I wanted to know,
Put them on the screen.
is there any other kind? Do you feel this project or the research around it has changed how you write personally, or how you approach your writing? And if so, how?
It totally does. In fact, even when I was working on this book, I would hear Carolyn Gordon's in my head, like, dangling participle or the grammar. Like, I really think about her feedback is so specific. So you write a scene, and what I understand about, for example, writing dialogue is dialogue needs to reflect the character. Dialogue needs to contribute to the conflict, and therefore dialogue propels the plot forward. And if dialogue doesn't do it, you throw it out. That's why nobody says hello or goodbye on the phone on TV, right? So dialogue has to accomplish all these things. But her idea that you give dialogue space to breathe, that the reader needs a moment to see a person within the action of dialogue and then see another person responding to that was really quite illuminating to me. I'm still thinking about her point of view and her narrative point of view, the stuff she said. That's still spinning in my head a little bit, but absolutely. And I teach her now. So in my creative writing class, one of the things I do that I love to do is I take the original, The Displaced Person, the first published version that ends after the first part. And then I have my students workshop the first version of the story. And then when they're done workshopping, we talk about, like, what would you recommend Flannery O'Connor do? And then we read the second version or the final version of The Displaced Person. And then we look at their critiques alongside of Carolyn Gordon's comments. And students start to realize, like, oh, I had something to say. I really could see what a writer could have done or how a writer could have shaped the story. And look at me, I said what Carolyn Gordon said, and then Carolyn Gordon supplies a different kind of language to explain what it is that O'Connor accomplished in that revision. And then I get to teach revision. So
I love that exercise. That's fabulous.
it's amazing. If you email me, I'll send you what I have on it. It's really, really fun. And it makes the students feel, they treat Flannery O'Connor like she's in the classroom. They're not ripping her apart. They're being nice to her, which is good because that's my class. That's the way we roll. But it really gives them a sense of like, oh, that's what this is about. That's how nothing comes out perfectly. Things don't just come out magically. You see other people.
It looks like Katie has a comment she wants to ask.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Christine. And I'm sorry because I got the time wrong. And so when you said I could talk forever, I was like, 10 minutes isn't very long. So if you've already addressed this, I apologize. But I was interested in hearing more about, I was really intrigued by this consciousness of the child recording and the different points of view. And so A View of the Woods, that's woods, not woos. I don't know if you already mentioned it though, so I wouldn't have put the question up if I'd realized I was late.
No, so Gordon made a really, and this goes to your squinched, those of you who are talking about squinched, the word squinched. This goes to a technique that Gordon is criticized for, and I'm going to be on Gordon's side here. She says that, she says the omniscient narrator is a different voice than the characters, right? If you're writing in first person, that's one thing. But if you're writing in third person, basically Gordon is saying there's a narrative voice and that needs to have some separation. We can find a million stories, by the way, to overthrow this. There should be some separation between the character's voice. So in Carolyn Gordon's experience, she would say the omniscient narrator speaks like Dr. Johnson. That means he will speak correct English. He will not use words like squinched or slurp, or that is the word of the character. And so Gordon insists, but what she's insisting on is good craft. She's saying you don't blur the lines willy-nilly, kind of. So with the stories that feature children, if you go back and look at either A View of the Woods or I would imagine Temple of the Holy Ghost, or just any of the stories, and if you really start to look closely, the stories that are the strongest are the ones where the narrative voice has its own, back in the day, they'd say like a godlike, omniscient, whatever, right? But the narrative voice has a kind of distinction from the character voice, whether that character is a child, because the narrative voice is the one that can say, there was a tree line like marching, the tree line of woods was marching across the sky or whatever. That's the narrative voice describing those items of setting, right? Those moments where you feel like the characters are finding some kind of transcendent, right? That's the narrative voice doing that. And even in the stories where there are children, like A View of the Woods, I think part of O'Connor, the craft of the success relies on the separation. Does that make sense? Of Mary Fortune. And then the narrative voice has to be separate from that. And it has to, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, because I've been thinking about that a lot. I've been writing about it. So I've been thinking about the view. Is there room for the woods to have a view, a consciousness or a perspective? And is O'Connor opening up that omniscient narrator to be possibly broader than, if God, right? If it's God, the old school God, then that would include the trees and the lake. So,
I think that's something, Katie. For so long, I was taught this whole idea of, that narrator is sort of this distant, invisible something. But I think you could make a case for what you're talking about, what O'Connor's artistic intention is behind that. Absolutely. I see Bruce asked about Eric Bankaju.
Yes.
you want gossip on Eric? They were friends. They were friends because Carolyn Gordon and Eric Lancaster were friends. There's something about like them going to lunch in New York, and Gordon actually writes O'Connor a letter about this in my book. And she's like, we went to lunch and I was hiding from another editor. I think, you know what, I could be blurring all the letters together, but she goes to lunch with Eric Lancaster in New York, and she's avoiding like an editor who ditched her or something. But she did not know at all about O'Connor's interest or infatuation with Lancaster until much, much later. I think Sally Fitzgerald told her. I'm not sure about that. I don't know why I think that. Yeah. But they did. They had a relationship again. So Carolyn Gordon knew everybody in New York, right? She knew him before O'Connor knew him. That's for sure. That's for certain.
You know, one of the things with the squinch conversation, the omniscient narrator being the devil, to what degree, it seems like there's a parting of ways as they move on. And particularly, you know, O'Connor's final stories, which are so just complete in and of themselves, that there seems a part. What did you notice in terms of how they interacted with each other?
Well, O'Connor grew up, you know, she grew up and she became a competent writer, and she had a sense of herself. She learned well from her mentor. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, O'Connor definitely got tired of, like, I think, what's the line O'Connor said, like, she'll sacrifice anything, like, to grammar. But so yeah, they went their own ways for many reasons. I mean, Carolyn Gordon also went through 2 divorces. She was having a really difficult time. She personally and professionally. There's a point in time where Carolyn Gordon's friends were asking Flannery O'Connor, could you blurb? Could you write her a book review? But here's what I'll stand by. At the end of O'Connor's life, Bruce, you're going to teach Parker's Back, is that right? There's something like 4,500 words in my book Gordon wrote on Parker's Back. Not all of them good, right? But at the end of her life, when O'Connor was trying to get feedback on Parker's Back, who did she send it to first? Not Catherine Carver. She sent Parker's Back to a friend. She sent, and then the friend said something like, yeah, it's good. And O'Connor didn't trust that. And O'Connor sent it to Gordon. So at the end of her life, when she was not feeling like she was getting good feedback from the one, O'Connor had this feeling like, she sent it to Gordon. So there she was after the 13 years, still knowing that Gordon would give her feedback, and a kind of detailed feedback that probably no one else would give her. That's what I would stand by. But they definitely went their own ways. O'Connor definitely became annoyed by her. And then there was the personality conflict. You know, Carolyn Gordon didn't get along with Regina. That wasn't not the welcome visitor that Lon Chaney was. Yeah, Bruce?
So was Carolyn Gordon her substitute mother? Did she make her a superior mother in place of Regina?
You know, I don't think so. And I struggle to identify what their relationship was, Carolyn Gordon. I mean, Carolyn Gordon was a mentor. Carolyn Gordon was a teacher, not an official teacher. She was not a mother. Although Carolyn Gordon would often refer to Flannery O'Connor as like the dear child when she was sick. But she really did not go to Gordon for anything but like, it was a working writer to writer relationship. Almost like an older sister who would annoy you or something. I don't know. I still, after all this time, I still can't pin down their relationship. It definitely wasn't, although that's why they weren't friends, because she was the age of her mother, right?
Now, Jim has a comment to make, and we'll let him wrap up the last question.
Well, I just wanted to say about squinching that, I really believe that Flannery, as many writers have, modified the omniscient narrator to make it more Southern. And I do not think the omniscient narrator necessarily speaks like Dr. Johnson, personally. So I disagree on that point, but I wanted to address something Sue said, and squinching brings up another point I want to get to, but there's two other things. One is, I think that O'Connor scholarship, really, I did not know Flannery, but I knew Mrs. O'Connor and I knew Sally very well. I worked at Georgia College Library from 1977 to 81. And I believe that the research on O'Connor really followed the manuscripts. When they became, and the book collection became part of the Flannery O'Connor room at Georgia College Library, that's when the researchers started flying in from Japan and everywhere else. And I think it was in the late 70s, it really was, because researchers, when I got to the library, were just beginning to fly in. I mean, they were really becoming a regular thing, and Gerald Beckham and Charles Beard, the librarians, were, Gerald Beckham was in charge of the O'Connor collection. The other thing was that in the first example you gave, Christine, the first sample of Caroline's suggestions for A Good Man Is Hard to Find. Is that the story we're discussing? Is that the one with the misfit? You notice that Flannery was not passive in these exchanges. Her mind was always working, because even in those three suggestions where she's adding place notes, she's also changing the dialogue a little bit, and she adds that little bit of street smart dialogue and says, "Get this," which is not in the previous draft. Where did she learn to say, "Get this"? She must have been addicted to film noir. I mean, where in Milledgeville would she have heard that? Of course, Carl Vinson said she couldn't possibly know what the inside of the men's restroom in the Macon train station looked like. How could she possibly know what? And Sally told me once, she said, when we made a rest stop in Dublin, Georgia, on the way for Sally giving a speech down in Savannah. And there were condom machines all over the wall. And there were these two women having this unbelievable conversation when Sally was in the ladies' room. And she said, "My dear," she said, "this just proves that Carl Vinson was sadly mistaken." Oh, I thank you for letting me share.
Carolyn Gordon loved O'Connor's ear. And Carolyn Gordon, a number of times in these letters, says, like, I can't believe, like, she will just say, "That's perfect." So she always applauds O'Connor's character's dialogue. She just gets mad at the narrative voice, but she says, like, "Business. Where did you come up with business?" She just loves O'Connor's dialogue, and her ear too.
Well, I think we have managed to burn up an hour with a lot of interesting discussion. And Christine, I'm so happy that you were able to come and chat with us. Thank you so much.
Too. It was
Thank
so
you,
good to
Christine.
see my Flannery, Sue, and everyone,
And new Flannerys. So
and new Flannerys too. Jim, thank you so much for sharing. Craig, thank you so much. And
Hey, let me,
somewhere Irene has my email if anybody has questions, talk more,
do you have any, you said you're going to say something, Bruce, or you're all set? Okay. All right. We'll see everybody tomorrow. We'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Ready
I'll
to
see
finish
you.
Wise Blood.
Right.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great. Thank you.